What, you're good?
So I would welcome in this case that we get a little bit unruly and just raise hands in the middle of. We won't have it as a kind of flow where I'm asking a couple of questions, because just that becomes, we lose that sort of dynamic momentum in that. So just raise your hand as soon as you have a question, and then I will stop. Okay. But the first, I just wanted to address what Zoe also brought up just within her own contextual work, which is that as curators, in a sense, depending on where we're working, this aspect of building trust and also sometimes negotiating or working with support systems to think through fears that artists and other cultural producers face. That's a very real circumstance, and often when working as independent curators or curators who are in high circulation, we forget this element and this responsibility. There are often cases where artists, I have personally had situations where artists have sort of said they have felt uncomfortable and found it very difficult to speak to biennial curators who are on very short research trips, to the point that they have then said they don't want to meet the next one who comes through the door or comes visiting. And since the hub is also that sort of space to address these kind of questions, maybe if you just share some experiences or also share situations in which you have perhaps taken that extra bit of effort in order to reassure artists, to make them feel that they actually can share and be their authentic self and not have to present a sort of facade of being over professionalized, etc. Because on the other hand, there are also cases where one goes to art schools in Europe these days, and you meet artists who haven't even finished their graduate courses and have their PDFs ready, very crisp, and run you through their work in 20 minutes, and you just feel quite empty. And you're just sort of like, but where is the person? So let's talk about this a little bit.
I have one example on the artist end and then also on the visiting curator end. So to young artists who are uncomfortable about meeting people that they don't know, predominantly because either they don't speak English fluently or they feel that they're not articulative, is that a word, of their own work. So what I suggest to them is that they bring someone in the room that they trust, who's a close friend of theirs, who does speak English and who knows their practice well. I always encourage artists to ask their friends to write about their work as well, because a lot of artists don't claim themselves to be writers. So I find encouraging artists to write with their friends and to get into a habit of thinking about that register of speech outside of just prose. So that could be poetry, it could be music, and I always do encourage artists to think about different ways of explaining their practice. When it comes to visiting curators, I always give feedback on the experience of the artist before they leave. So when I'm actually facilitating curator visits, I will have a one-on-one 5-minute little thing. I'll say, how was it? What happened? Were you able to share what you wanted to share? And if there's any critical feedback, I will give it back. On a number of occasions, I've been quite upfront with curators and saying, you really offended them and they were in tears. So I will say it.
I have an example. It's a little long. First of all, can everyone hear me? Not very well. Not well? I might hold it as well. I won't share a personal experience, but I will say that sometimes it also behooves the artist to put a little pressure on the curator. There is often asymmetric relationship between curators and artists, and I think it behooves us as curators to sort of recognize that. But like you, Zoe, I also believe that every sort of relationship with an artist starts with trust and getting to know them before we sort of get to know the art. There are also a couple models that I've been interested in seeing, not just from my own practice, but one is, well, one of these sort of powerful curators, Francesco Vazzoli, who actually has a kind of even practice where in all of his studio visits, he refuses to speak. And I think it's strange. It's not something that I would sort of adhere to as a process, but what it allows is a kind of equality across every studio visit. In other words, he has the same practice in every studio visit because he also understands that some people may interpret different gestures as a kind of, let's say, preference. The other model I'm interested in is Helen Molesworth, where she has decided that she will only work at this point in her career with certain artists. Again, I think that forecloses a lot of things, but what she's trying to get to is that curating sometimes is about an intimacy with the artist and with the practice, and therefore it behooves someone to develop a deep relationship with someone and work that over time, over and over again, so that every show isn't about the new, the next, the young, hot thing, but really about following a practice over decades, if one's so lucky.
Can you hear me? Yeah. I'm audible. I think that touched on some important things. I think trust and respect is a big thing. I think the curator has a huge responsibility stepping into someone else's zone, artistic zone. I think, being curators, being interested in art, we like difference, We're not looking for the same thing all the time, So an artist has to be themselves. Personally, I'm very conscious when I'm visiting artists in a place that I don't live, and usually I try to best equip myself and understand the context before I start stepping into studios. Often that relies on research, but also networks, and making sure I've got the right people introducing me to artists. But I think I'm absolutely aware of going into hot-headed. And you'll miss things, if you go in with an arrogance. I think you'll certainly miss great things. So, I think that's.
Anyone else want to share something?
I think for young curators out there, it's important to start doing visits with your peer groups without the pressure kind of expectation. So just to kind of learn about somebody's work without having to think about, oh, I need it for a show, or I want to include you in something. So just kind of getting the comfort level of meeting with artists regularly. When I was a young curator at the Bronx Museum, we had a program where we had 36 artists, emerging artists every year come through, and then we'd have to do studio visits with them all. And it was a great way to just kind of, in an informal way, get to know all of them and find out more about their work. But I also wanted to maybe bring up an example from the other end. An artist friend of mine had a show in a major American museum and told me that a curator friend had invited him to have a solo show. And he said at the end of the process, he gained a curator, but he lost a friend. So that was...
Yeah, this is... No, just, I think the only thing that I felt while I was doing, that you have to have a lot of time. If you think that you can sort of, have an hour slot, this is like an absolute no-no. You have to have enough time so that, and then you have to just be a very open person to listen to it. So you don't have to speak. It's a really, as a curator, it's an act of really listening. And allowing the artist to tell you whatever they want to tell you first, before you start asking any questions. It's really listening a lot. I know, it's a very tricky thing. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't work. But I also just want to tell one story about how it works also, In Copenhagen, I was, and we didn't do so much research, but some research. And then and by chance, it's like, because as I said, I haven't studied in Europe, so I'm not familiar with that. So you have 6 names, and you quickly look at, my research assistants say, okay, they make some kind of a short list for me. And by chance, I said that, this is interesting for me, E.B. Itzo. But I go and meet E.B. Itzo. And what a connection to the work. I mean, so this kind of a thing also happens, you know, in a short meeting, but you have a real connect of ideas and the way another person is thinking. So it's not always, it's a volatile thing, you know, when, especially if you're not, like an artist is not from your own, like, you know, country or, you know, where you actually are meeting them often. So you're going outside and, you know, spending a very short time. And so it's a tricky thing, very tricky thing. But some good things also happen with that, yeah. No, so.
So I'll just, is this on? So the one thing I think we like doing as another sort of ethos and way of living in the studio, and also when we make works, is a presumption of equality, right? It's not there, it's often not there with the subjects you're working with or filming, and it's often not there with the curators who are coming. But if you have a presumption of equality as a sort of first form of address, we really believe it works, right? The trust gets built, the honesty sort of is embedded in that immediate form of address. Having said that, we have started telling curators, did you get your PowerPoint? And you present to us. And I don't mean it in as a cheeky way as it sounds, but really, like, let's talk about you as well, and, you know, and how you work. And you know, in a space like camp that can last from like 1 hour to dinner or whatever, but it really is a nice way of also turning the form of address around, and then the trust emerges, the ideas.
Really good.
And the third was, you know, did you say Hal Foster said it? Find the idea and then commission it. We've often had that happen, right? And then things unravel. Like, it's just an anecdote, but when these Pompidou curators came, they had this, they wanted to, you know, they had the idea and they wanted us to fit into it and then fit into some mandala, and of course this mandala was about sharing and food, and we simply told them to fuck off. We told a lot of artists, we knew, you know, in Bangalore and Delhi, we knew who these people were visiting, and we told them, like, just watch out, really. And they were like, did you get the dossier? I'm like, what dossier? We made this reader on India that we'd sent you by post, and then we didn't know it was there, but then we dug around and a fact reader was sent by these curators to Indian artists, right? And so we warned as many, and many took part. Now, so what I'm trying to say is learn to say no when it just sounds so wrong.
Yeah.
So when the show opened and stuff, we had some artists who were confident enough and had the gumption to say, we participate only if you acquire our work. And others who were just traumatized, right? And we're like, what were we doing in this Orientalist mess up of a show? And we're like, say no, you know? So I think,
just say no.
And I'm speaking as an artist here. Have the confidence, you have a sixth sense, you have a peer group, you have friends. Do it together. If everyone had said no to that damn show, it would not have taken place. And you can boycott. It's not such a bad thing.
No, I think we need to write a manual on like how to say fuck off, you know.
2 syllables.
No, because I mean, I work in a context where, you know, the power equations are so, you know, lopsided that it takes, I mean, when I'm really trying to think of artists who are my friends, like when are they going to get to a point, and I hope soon, right? But when they can say that, right? I mean, we're working in a very sort of, you know, and to connect this to sort of the lookout for virgin territories, right? And narratives and da-da-da, it's real, right? It's there. Because on the one hand, and then also like on the one hand, there are people like me who are like, but what about us, you know, and how do you define your region, and da-da-da-da. So there is this pressure to be inclusive and to look beyond the definitive sort of existing frameworks. But then, you know, then the political correctness also seeps in, right? And so when one is working, I suppose, in that pressure, one does try to go to new communities and new spaces of production, I suppose. But then on the flip side, for us, like I've really seen, you know, young artists really struggle. Like they don't have the articulation, they don't have the language, they don't have a studio to begin with, right? They don't have like physical space to even invite curators in. And then very quickly also there are these like expectations that really pile up. And they really, so whether it's a curator or whether it's a collector who's come into town, like, do you know so-and-so's in town, you know? And then like all the grabbing begins and all the like the gatekeeping plays out, right? And all of that does play out. And very quickly, for us it's happened very quickly in the last just couple of years, I think, that you begin to see that practices are shaped in very specific ways. And young artists are playing to curators, playing to the collectors, playing to what they perceive people want to see, or you know, and what they perceive. I mean, representation is a real thing, right? What they perceive, you know, of themselves even, and the way they need to represent Nepal or wherever their community. So yeah, how to navigate that, and then because I am not a parachute curator, let's just call it that. No, just kidding. But I still feel the responsibility, you know, like I am still seen as a gatekeeper, even though I live in the city that the people I work with live in the same place as I do, because I come to forums like this and I'm like wherever, right, go to this and that. And so the responsibility does, I think, I mean, for me even, you know, it's real. And so how to create structures, how to be mindful of this, how to continue to create space for the conversation, as uncomfortable as it is, you know. These are real challenges. So.
But can I also just add too that we are talking about a very traditional sort of studio visit to exhibition model. And the other thing that I heard very clearly this week is that there are other ways to engage with artists, and other ways to engage with the practice, and other ways to also disseminate that practice too. And so I maybe don't have an answer to what it means to have a larger responsibility, but I also realize that part of my job isn't just to make exhibitions and show the work, but part of my job is to write about the work. Part of my job is to make sure people get money and funding. Part of my job is to make introductions and play the mediator at times. I think that we all have to understand that our responsibility is to the artist, hopefully more so than the object, and that responsibility is multifarious. And part of building that trust isn't just about making sure the object is shown, but making sure that there are big narratives in the world around artists and that work.
Are there already questions? Okay.
Mike?
Hi, my name is Parag, and this question is to Naomi. It was very inspiring
Louder,
presentation.
please, louder.
It was an inspiring presentation, and I want to share one story of my family who had black slaves, my great-grandfather. So there were slaves who were bought from Portuguese friend of my grandfather, and my grandfather was sailor, and he has a boat factory. So those slaves were used for carving the boats. And one day, they saw our mother goddesses, and in Thane, which is central suburb of Bombay, Mumbai. So I thought I'll share this because it was very important change in our mother goddess. So there were temporal forms in those mother goddesses, which those carpenters changed into permanent forms. We still have those objects, and we use those objects. And later, because of that permanent additives, armatures, we also changed the other mother goddesses.
Wow.
So this is oral history from which I learn here from my granny and my father, because the objects which are there are very abstract. And our mother goddesses were abstract actually, but what he added is very nice one. So my question is this, that there are many trades around the world which would have gone, means slaves were sold around the world actually. And there are many stories like what I am telling you. Means this is very short, but this is very interesting and very closer to me. That's why. So what you think, are there people who are documenting this kind of micro, macro kind of narratives in Black history? Because I recently worked on color politics, but it was inspired through Black history. So,
thank you, Parag. The short answer is yes, maybe not in the particularity of your story, but we also heard some beautiful, I think, narratives and projects today and this week, first starting with Zoe, and her projects with artists who are interested in that long kind of recuperation of historic narratives around the movement of people, and in this case, especially Africans, around the world. I loved what Anita said toward the end of her project, or her presentation, which is, I don't believe in purity. And that reminded me of this segment of Kwame Anthony Appiah, the writer and ethicist, thinking about the word contamination. And he says contamination has gotten a kind of negative connotation now, but in fact, in its Latin root, it means a kind of mixing from which something else is born. And that the way that our world has functioned historically and all the time has been through this kind of contamination. And so the things that we hold dear as tradition, the things that we hold as maybe national figures and regional figures, regional purity, are always, in fact, something that comes from élange, métis, exchange. And that it is more important to then start building up archives, which is another theme that I see running through a lot of these presentations, build up these sort of living and shareable archives where these stories become relevant, and start making a kind of historical foundation for things that also still happen in the contemporary moment. So last night I gave a talk and someone told me that the poems of Langston Hughes, who we saw was funded by the CIA to go to the Bandung conference, have been translated into Bengali songs. And that made my heart sing. Because at the beginning of my presentation, it was basically asking an existential question. Why am I here? What is the value of a voice like mine here? Not to say that I presume that you didn't see a value, but what are we exchanging? What is the information here? But we have to remember that that exchange had already been happening before I got here, and we need to remember and honor that at all times.
Okay, but is there anyone who hasn't asked a question as yet? That sounds slightly classroom-like. Is there anyone? Not right.
Oh, there.
At the back. Okay, great.
Okay, good.
My question is basically about this sort of negotiation that every curator here is speaking about, how the art world sort of relates to its outside, how the art world negotiates the outside. And there's a broad sort of like consensus that the art world is supposed to deliver a certain promise of inclusive democracy, include more voices, give power to the disempowered, and so on. Here I find it quite interesting that, especially in a couple of presentations, that we actually have something like a theory of friction through which we can think of curation. And I mean friction in the same sense that Anna Singh is writing about friction as the foundational force of like modern capitalism. Capitalism is not something that works without friction, but precisely makes use of various sorts of social frictions, material frictions, and it is through a tactical sort of working, and capitalism precisely has to renegotiate friction at every juncture in order to be able to deliver what it delivers. I think like there's a sort of embryo of a theory of curation that I find, which talks of, say, tactical visibility. It's a question of measuring this against that and finding an axis through which to work. So, like, would all the curators, if they want, respond to that sort of a question?
I can. Oh yeah. Okay. One is aware of that, right? And this is why what I was saying is that the other space was very important, the space of the pavilion, which I very much wanted to think of as a totally anarchic space, where really you could fight, you could argue and fight, and you could actually say, yeah, bollocks, this exhibition has all these, it is connected to this, it's connected to tourism, it's connected to this, because those are actually the funding truths that actually are fueling that structure. So you need, so if a structured space like the exhibition exists, its opposite is also needed. And that's when I keep saying that I felt that there's an absolute need for this space in which, just the way we are sitting around, and even like more fireworks, like really people being able to express themselves, not necessarily things that we would like to hear, even things that you would not like to hear, because we haven't heard each other enough, actually. So really to think, and therefore just recognizing the need for that other very, very volatile and anarchic space to this other space. But actually, I think our education system has actually suppressed all this thing. And therefore people are not able to, even if you make a space possible, they are not able to occupy it. And this was frustrating, actually. So just to share that, yeah. Because I think all this, this fighting, we've been suppressed, actually. The education system has suppressed all that. So, yeah.
That and the sort of the need to have consensus, like the whole
Yeah.
volatile and anarchic
Yeah.
safe
Yeah.
space, right? Like, how do you create that? Because now with safe space, like you have to become so politically correct. So now, like that presumption of equality to create volatility.
Yeah.
And anarchy.
Yeah, absolutely.
And safety in a space.
How do we subvert it? It's a very simple thing. How do we subvert it?
Subvert what?
This consensus that you're talking about, the lack of debate. What strategies can we employ together to subvert this kind of a consensus building that, okay, look, I don't want to say anything because it might offend one of you. I don't want to say something because it might offend, okay, let's just be yes men. How do we,
we have to pick up the mic and speak and not be afraid. I don't know, we have to, so that's why warmth, to make that possible.
But also in terms of just thinking to these kind of homegrown, what Anita used the word homegrown, which is a it's a great term. It's a funny term, and so homegrown strategies. I think this is a very important question, because if you think back to the kind of popular traditions, the theatre traditions that we have had in this country that are currently being suppressed because again they don't align with a certain majoritarian religious iconography, performativity, etc. Were all about disagreement, all about the many faces, the many possibilities, counter-argumentation, contrapuntal rhythms. So that actually is there. That's all there for us. So while we talk about a certain kind of Western education that may have suppressed this, actually everything else that has to do with, I really think it would be great to go back to some of those forms and really think about how to use them, how to apply them, because they are there for us. That's just one.
Not necessarily Western education. I think the whole education system, even the region, even the government education, it is just suppressed. Of course.
Want to be wicked?
Answering his question, whenever required, be wicked.
Oh, yeah.
I think also we don't have to just think of exhibitions as static things, they're put together and they're all of a sudden frozen, Exhibitions rely on reviews, responses, audiences. Their meaning can change, the curatorial intent can completely get changed by responses, by reviews, by artists then doing things in other exhibitions in response to that. I think it's all part of an evolving process. I think it's important that we have many forums for exhibitions so that different exhibitions can respond to each other, and you have, kind of a multiplicity of platforms, and conversations around them can evolve.
Can you please start?
I'm so glad this is a conversation in English, so that I can be a part of it. I love being at the Kochi Biennale, and I remember meeting Bapi Das for the first time there. After I asked a volunteer who was there, "Can you find this artist?" I really connected to his work. But the volunteer who was there, and there was a great number of volunteers there, they didn't speak Bengali, and I only knew Bondu Bai, Bondu, and that was what we got reduced to at the end, was brother, friend. And I'm just wondering if there's any way, when you talk about making the pavilion, which I thought was a wonderful idea, accessible, or making ideas accessible, ideologies accessible, non-majoritarian. I mean, very small number of people in India speak English. It's a challenge that we face as English speakers when we go outside. Is there any thought to, or do any of you specifically ask for funding or resources to support interpretation as a major component of your project? I do think that with the Kochi Biennale, you did great with Malayalam. That was so much there, but that was a piece of it, including with the Student Biennale, where I thought, gosh, if we just had, trained, or not even trained, just people who could, getting to your point, Zoe, being sort of the champion for someone in the language that could make the whole thing more accessible.
I mean, we asked for everything. We said that in the pavilion there has to be translation. Malayalam, English, English, Malayalam as a basic thing. But, you can, as I said, that, everything is on paper that we asked for, but we didn't get it. Because it's, so that's another matter. We asked for all these things.
I guess maybe as someone who represents a government, where we maybe don't see those asks, and if someone had come to, for instance, the U.S. consulate and said specifically what we could use, and so that's good for us to know that that's an ask that's happening, that you've already thought about that, that's being asked, and so then also how to move around sometimes the no's that you're getting, because I think that that's a space where, irrespective of the cultural institution or the government, that's really easy for us to understand, that a small number of people will be speaking our respective language.
There's also a level of mediation between what's happening on the ground, the institution, and outside supporters. I think it's maybe important for the supporters to start talking directly to the artists and the exhibition makers rather than talking to the administration.
In learning about your different curatorial practices, I've been thinking about the different roles a curator plays, like curator as an archivist, curator as a historian, as an educator, community organizer, and confidant or friend. And I was wondering if there's any other roles, like curator as a blank, you could emphasize on.
Paperwork. Paperwork.
Administrator. Fundraiser.
Accountant. Psychologist. But it is true, there are times when you need to stabilize an artist.
I think is a good one.
You really sometimes have to stabilize a practice. And not every, as we said before, not every artist studio you walk into is ready for a certain presentation. There have been times where I've known that we've had to pay an artist light bill before we can start a conversation around presenting the work in a gallery. So yes, I think the sensitivity is the question of what roles do you have to play with each artist, which is why I say maybe I don't subscribe to Francesco Rizzoli's idea that I just won't speak. You have to, every situation is different, and you have to be malleable as a person, as a human being, not just a curator, to figure out what the needs are to get to the point where exhibition or whatever project you're working on is even possible.
Anyone else want to fill the blank?
Why are you looking at me?
Sorry. I have a tendency to stare. No. Okay.
Well, since you are, can I just say this?
Yes, of course.
Caregiver and key giver.
Yeah. Caregiver and key giver, accountant, paperwork,
Whistleblower.
whistleblower. It's a good list.
Friend.
I would
I
also
wanted to
say,
say something on
It's a
that
good
real
list.
quick.
Yeah, yeah.
It's just, I mean, this is an open, safe space, right? We're all here. Ooh, Mike's not
Volatile and anarchy.
volatile.
We have to make it. It's not volatile enough.
No, but some of these things, just going back to sort of roles, you know, I think a question that keeps coming back is like, well, whose job is it? Like, this is not happening, that is not happening, da, da, da. And so, well, whose job is it to make this happen, right? And so I think a lot of us work in contexts where, I mean, I keep calling it DIY because for us that's how it feels, you know. But even this whistleblowing thing, right? It's like, well, whose job is it to actually put some of these things in place, you know? So, so this, I mean, even in today's context, you know, like you were referring to, I mean, this role that we seem to play, if we want to be vocal about anything, whether it's like whistleblowing, you know, on issues of sexual harassment, or it's talking about fair wage, or it's talking about, you know, the roles of negotiating funding, you know, like there are so many challenges that we're constantly navigating. I don't know, it's this ownership of sort of, I don't know what to call it, responsibility, and this sense of sort of, well, if we want this to happen, like, let's hustle, you know, and then it ends up coming back onto you so often. Because I work in a context where I actually don't even have fingers to point towards, you know, like I don't have an institution to blame or like a foundation to put it on or whatever, right? So, yeah, it's.
I also want to add to that too.
Okay.
I just want to add that I think a curator should be a public speaker. And to be a public speaker is then to lead. And then in answer to your question as to how to challenge the census, is you create a leadership around you. And that you create events with those other leaders where you demonstrate contested opinion in public and your ability to swallow that criticism and to embrace it publicly and say, I respect your difference of opinion. I understand why you come from this perspective because, however, and then to argue the point. I think everything in society today for culture is we are ghettoized. We are speaking to ourselves far too often, and we need to start embedding ourselves in other sectors of the social fabric to make our voices actually start to activate change. And I've started small steps with the World Economic Forum, and I was scared shitless about entering that community. And it's taught me a lot about how my voice, a very simple, single voice, can start to seed other things. And it just is about having courage to speak.
Thank you.
Okay. I just want to say one thing, which maybe we can unpack later, but the idea of witness that Anita brought up, and I think it relates very closely to what Zoe is saying and what Nayantara is saying.
Okay, I know I'm in a safe space, so I'm going to say this. You know, I'm surrounded by curators here who are all important voices and have a point of view. I run a gallery, and like Priyanka and Pratik, and I often wonder that what is the difference between a curator and a gallery owner? What really separates our jobs? Because you're doing all those things that we do. Only we don't call ourselves curators. So if you'd like to shed some light on that. Because we're constantly facing this question of, but you're not a curator, you're a gallery owner. But we're also curating.
Absolutely. You're absolutely curating. Yeah.
So,
I don't see any strict definition. about this.
Yeah, but
No, I'd like to say something
So,
about that. No, but I'd like to say something.
Yeah.
The difference is theory, basically critical theory. So, which is what I was saying, that in India, for the longest time, we think that critical theory is not important. Sensibility and a connection with visuality is enough to sort of put together exhibitions. But actually, this is the problem, because, critical theory, to think of the history of exhibition making. So history, art history, like why is art history important? Similarly, why is critical theory important? Because critical theory, you will engage with the fact that these thought processes, there is a history to it. Where do you figure in that history? What do you want to do with that history? How do you want to make changes within that history? All those things become important with critical theory. So this is the difference, because curators, in some senses, study or are within this whole realm of critical theory.
I would like to say though,
I grant them that. It's just a question which
No, but it's
this
a
is my
very,
take
it's
on
a, it's
Yeah,
a
I just-
question that we really should
I just
clarify.
felt I'm safe here to ask it
It's
because
not-
there are intelligent people here who are open-minded enough to receive the question with an open mind. Yeah.
No, but it's also important to clarify this, and it's very good to have asked it.
Yeah.
Because actually, it's really something that needs clarity. Because, just personally speaking again, the fact that we are in a context, and again, this is not exclusive to India, South Asia, but it's definitely a majority of the time kind of situation, where the people, firstly, who can afford to start a gallery are mostly collectors. They are collectors, they are enthusiasts of art, they have a certain family history in which art plays a dominant role, and therefore they are also able to take on this role of being gallerists, at the same time being collectors. At the same time, they are also people who can run publication platforms, have programs, etc. So definitely they're playing a big role. But the problem that I saw, for instance, when I was a young, curator in my early 20s, was that I was feeling as though the only place I could actually do my first exhibition would be in a small white cube in New Delhi, and not be enough freedom for me to choose artists, experimentally, play with formats, really sort of think openly, because you're basically curating for a gallery. And I'm not saying there's something wrong with that, but that should not be the limitation of this generation of curators. And that was very, very important to me. And I still take responsibility to say, okay, for this next generation of curators, how to think of different opportunities. Because we cannot be trapped in this profession in such a way that you have galleries breathing down your neck and saying, I want 4 artists from my gallery, 2 can be of your choice. We are not going to work like that, and we want the respect of the kind of actually very unique position that curating is. And that's why, the first thing was to make a issue on curating for Take on Art and things like that, because there was no clarity. What are y'all? Who are y'all? Just come and do a show here. It's fine.
I would like to say though, I think for aspiring curators, I mean, any opportunity to curate something is curating still. And I don't think that we can get too precious about the term either. I don't think that's constructive. I think there's been amazing exhibitions curated in commercial spaces in India, many which I've seen, and I know there are limited big public institutions as platforms for curators. I'd also like to say, in response to Anita, I don't think you can, this critical theory debate, I think, that is a privilege if you've got access to that knowledge. But, I've visited a lot of contexts where, young people are no artists, they facilitate projects, they do exhibitions, and they often don't think of themselves as curators because, they haven't done their masters, they haven't travelled around the world and learnt. And I say, no, you're absolutely curators. You're making it happen. So I think it is a bit problematic to get very precious about this term as well. I see it as very fluid. You're facilitating, you're encouraging, you're instigating.
The term
I think I said it only in this context because there, as I said when I was saying that, there's this long history of, an anti-intellectual history, a history where artists think that it's enough, that you don't need to, you don't need to read. You just have to have a sensibility and a visuality. And I think this is somewhere, it's just such a long history to that, and which is...
Isn't it such a presumption to say that if you don't come from criticality or art history, you may only deal with aesthetics and sensibility? I disagree so deeply.
No, I'm not kind of. I'm not making this kind of thing. But what I'm saying is, when there's this long history,
I was saying I disagree so deeply that if you don't come from an art history background, your response to exhibition making is only through aesthetics and visuality. I don't agree at all. It is very specific. And yes, Anita, I know the context you're coming from. I live in the same context that you do. But to generalize anything in our world today is the worst thing we can do. I also want to respond to Natasha. I also don't think, and because you made it general, because you said it is not about a specific example. Gallerists are collectors, gallerists have the resource, so gallerists can do whatever. I, again, disagree very, very deeply with that. Again, individual perspectives. And I know you know enough different sorts of examples, but the minute we speak in public forums such as this and generalize for an audience that may actually think of only the tip of the iceberg as the whole image, it's very important to be quite specific about some examples and not all examples, because there are so many in the world and a few in the country as well that are not collectors, run on very meager means and have made things happen in a certain way. Also to Reena, people are asking, are you a gallerist? Are you, again, as she said, say fuck off. You know, it doesn't matter.
I'm actually going to argue that it does matter.
No, it doesn't matter. If you
I do. I really do think it matters. And you're right. Context is deeply important. So to your question of what role are we playing, there are certain contexts where you can specialize, where there's a gallerist over here and a curator over there, and sometimes they meet, sometimes they don't, and there's some contexts you have to play all those roles. There's no place in the States that's holding a forum like this for critical debate that is inside a commercial gallery, right? You are in a context where you are filling a really important role, even as a commercial site. This is amazing. But can I just finish my point? Actually, as the mic's going back, I'm going to finish the point. Yes. Which is to say, though, I think Anita's point about a history of something, maybe critical theory, maybe is a little misinterpreted. I think the point is about the history. And I say when I'm working with artists all the time that my goal is not to make you famous. My goal is to put you in a narrative for a future audience. Right. And I tell all my artists to imagine a moment when you're not here and you're not alive. That's the moment that I'm thinking about. I don't really care that much about your career right now. I don't care about my career right now. The question is, you know, outside of the moment of the exhibition, the moment of the show, the moment of the sales, what stories are going to be told about this moment now? Who gets to read about it, hear about it, and how do we insert ourselves into a long history, whether we call it a critical theory or not? And so that's for me what it means to be a curator, to have a long conversation about culture.
I know, but just because there are two questions by people who have not still asked, and she's more responding. So just please let me just try and do this moderation role a little bit more and then take these two questions and then...
This issue was raised on a peripheral way by Naomi when she showed her slides about the opium issue that broke in the US. Those who are not familiar with it, it was a pharmaceutical company which for years had been selling drugs and had made billions of dollars on that. Eventually, they were caught up with the courts, and the court are asking them to pay back about $600 billion to the public. But the issue I'm raising is the museums and other theater companies were funded through the Sackler family. They came out, particularly Sackler Gallery, National Portrait Gallery in the UK, rejected to say that they will not take any more new grants coming from the family. Now, this is an issue that all the museums and the curators must be facing when you are working with the with the biennales or triennales? And is there a filtering system? That's my question. Is there a filtering system that is in place or that is to be considered on how do you assess and accept or reject grants?
There's a process called due diligence where you have to research where your funders' monies are coming from, or even, I mean, I'm not in a collecting institution, or who's giving you a gift of even an artwork. And I think artists are starting to ask this question as well. Will I sell to a collector that has made their money in a dubious way? Will I sell my work to an arms dealer or to somebody who's putting spyware on to your phone? And I think that is maybe the crux of the difference between a public institution and potentially a commercial gallery. A commercial gallery is not going to be asked to give that money back to the collector who's paid work for money that they made from illicit arms dealing, for example.
But does a commercial gallery even ask that question?
All the time.
Some do, some don't. Some do not don't.
I think it's everybody's responsibility.
Because every commercial gallery also has an opinion and a program.
Yeah.
Which they believe in strongly. So do they ask this question?
I think some
as to
do,
where
but not
their
all
monies
of them.
come from, irrespective of the fact that you don't have to give it.
Depends on your own politics.
There's just 1 minute.
Yeah.
Just to, yeah.
I was just responding to a couple of things. One was the kind of coming from the intent, not from the position what we actually are labeling anybody from. I think we can actually see when there is no burden of a space, the processes or the speed of functioning multiplies by 10 times at least, particularly in Antares and Zoe's case, because the moment you kind of have this burdens of paperwork filing and the brick and mortar expenses all kind of being answerable to somebody, you actually lose a lot of things in between because your time is limited. And that idea of kind of spending that kind of energy functioning into a structure actually sacrifices the real intent of it. Number two was that if actually you talk about the cultural production, it cannot happen in a white cube spaces. It has to happen through spaces where there is no electricity or where there is no infrastructure. I think if you're really talking about the curator as a caregiver, I think it actually graduates way further from a white cube space or a conventional mode of exhibition making, which actually probably like 100 years or 50 years of history. I think a couple of things, like it actually clearly shows in the set of presentations where her work actually graduates into a realm where it is coming from, not from a aesthetic point of view, but actually excavating memories point of view. So.
Can I say something?
Yeah.
I just do want to respond to the excitement, which I'm very grateful for, that people seem to respond with, like show the photograph onto video, for example, or whatever. No? And then like I was giving my shit the other day too. And then somebody said something to me like a month ago as well, which really has made me think about this a bit, which is to say that I think how to negotiate this balance, right, between really, and last night, Zoe, you were saying, you don't need a space, you know, because I was saying, like, I think now we're feeling like we need a space, you know. There is a bit of romanticization that happens around, you know, this kind of like, freedom. Exactly, right, and then I think somebody called it the, what was it, the aesthetic of poverty, or something like this. Was it that? No. What was it? Etc. But just to say that, right, it's like there are some practical things that we all sort of have, right? And I think what you said earlier about sort of intention and the politics behind all of it, right? I feel like I still have to deal with paperwork. I still have to pay taxes. We have two entities that we run also, you know, and there is this, I mean, all of that is there. But I do agree with you that there is a certain element of freedom and independence when it doesn't, when it's not entirely a commercial, I think, endeavor, right? And so to also speak to what I think the question between gallerist and curator, I think the way I started thinking about it just very recently is we've been invited back to the India Art Fair. And we were there last year, but just we had some stuff on a wall. And this time we have been offered this pro bono booth. I mean, there's no way we could go by, if it wasn't pro bono, right, if we were actually paying for this thing. But we thought, okay, maybe this could be, you know, like we do need to think about diversifying our funding strategies and our fundraising strategies. And so we said, okay, you know, we would like to come. This is an opportunity. But already in my head, there's such a quick cartwheel that has happened in terms of what I would put in that booth, right? Because now already I'm thinking, what would sell, right? And so it was so quick. And so, you know, I suppose one is faced with these realities. But then also, yeah, there are galleries who there is absolutely nothing wrong with selling, right? There are artists back home who I am friends with and I work with who I really wish would sell more. Because we all need to live and you know, and you want them to succeed, and in this world success unfortunately is equated to selling also and being collected and but how to balance all of that still with your politics, with your integrity, with your intentions, you know, Priyanka was saying, yeah, we, you know, do all this programming by existing as a gallery. You know, you were saying this yesterday, I think, etc. So different people find different ways, I think. I think it's really like driven by what you want to do, your politics, the integrity,
And then so we have two questions.
Okay. Go ahead. Mike.
This is in regard to you know, the critical theory and sort of a denial to the intellect, both you know, from the artist side and the gallery. You know, there is a huge section of artists who've formed very important, significant texts. And that has percolated, definitely. They might be, you know, small in number, but that is, as a practice, that has percolated. And there are artists, many artists now, who would not refuse to, you know, quote unquote, intellect, as you said. And same with the gallery, I believe, because there are gallery who've sort of, you know, cultivated that, if not in a formal manner, but of course cultivated that. And that is also, I see that also as a form of percolation.
So I take back the generalization. Yes, I do. Absolutely. But similarly, I want to just ask you, why are you doing this? Isn't it an interest in then the discursive, the intellectualization around art and culture? So you're doing this because to also foreground that, no? So to also give it that a platform or value. Yeah. Now, like just a sort of, you know. So my thing is, I take back the generalization, but I ask the question as to why are we doing this?
First, Pratik and Priyanka started this space with a vision.
Yeah.
That vision had multiple things, not conforming to any of the things you understand a space that runs and represents artists can do. You may say in India, if you're a gallery, then you represent artists and you do the art fair. Pratik decided, Priyanka decided, that's not what we envision our space to be from the beginning. At that point, we didn't even think when we were showing like ephemeral shows and such things, those would sell. But show one, year one, 20-something-year-olds were able to sell that to Tate, right? So it was possible to sit in that bathroom office of ours, and it was possible to do that. We kept belief, we kept doing things. We didn't change our model, no matter what anyone else thought was the intention. The intention was our vision. The vision was to do this. We had corporate careers, we decided to do this. Now I'm hopeful another whole generation of youngsters may come and change this model and say our model will be that. And we're nobody to say, but galleries should do this. If their model is to create music and have really serious underground music thing, and you'll be surprised of what we're up to next. Another 5 years later, you might see us as a very different entity. See the projects we quote-unquote supporting by getting money from, this art and culture creation, right? We might do more things. Who can decide what we can do? The wonderful thing is we're not dependent on any external body funding. We're answerable to our own decisions and a communal table where the 10 of us sit. Every decision is taken together. If someone comes to us, there's the boss there, Uma, and Vidya and Shivana, and all these people who sit, we vote, we decide, and even our decisions are not necessarily final. Most often she puts the span on every wheel, and then we make a decision. That's our model and that's our intention. It started in 2008 and we'll continue it to 2088 or whenever.
Okay, thank you.
No, I just wanted to take on from what Reena said, as in the role of gallerist as a curator. So I feel that while some galleries, some gallerists are able to put up a strong show and they have but that's not the case with all galleries. So I think the role of a curator is very important because see, they're trained in the art of exhibition making, art history, critical thinking and all that. And so I think, yes, at many junctures they are needed, So because all spaces, all galleries, you don't see the same consistency. You know what I mean?
But also, just for clarity, what I was just trying to say is that for a longer time now, things are changing rapidly. But that 10 years ago, also say 11 years ago, the role of curators in India was overly relying on galleries. That is the issue. So there was a limit to, and art writers as well, where because you're relying on your paycheck, which comes from this very labor of writing texts, giving talks, and making shows, and having your little workshops for artists and with artists, which are more about a communal time in which you're shelling out that money. So that is.
Context, you feel bad saying you're a gallerist in India,
Any case,
Okay,
so
no,
things
so-
are changing. So that's why now
It's
there are
not
more
pointed
things.
towards you.
There are more things that curators can do, but that equation was very,
not
very
pointed
tough,
towards
especially
you.
for independent curators who are not then collection advisors, etc. There was not enough economy around this profession, and it is still a struggle. I just wanted to highlight that. That's all, really. Okay. Yeah, you have a question.
I think, hello, hello? Yeah. Okay. So I think I want to reflect something what he said, like how to, can you hear me?
It's not
Yeah.
Hello? Yeah. So I'd like to kind of reflect what you'd like to share, that how to sabotage or subvert that things. Because this is something I'm constantly thinking all of the time. I'm kind of writing on, planning for do research, that is there any way? Okay, so 2017 or sometime, there is a space called WCC in Denmark, and they're asking for some presentation on regarding that, how to subvert that kind of problem, how to communicate, right? So I have, is the suggestion 3 model or 3 text I found. It's kind of important, I found. One of the 2 texts is 7 document written by Charu Majumdar. Okay, it's talking about how to ground back to the reality. And the second letter I refer about the last letter written by Rohit Bemula, the lack of communications, that where is the left? Because everybody talking about the left is basically left is, yeah, pushing. Like I grew up, which is the other side of the city, it's like a West Berlin. And it's like off-center politics, everybody pushing that you are left than left. So everybody pushing to the corner, and then you are into absolutely the edge. So this is one, I think it's one way of looking that need more communication and back to the commune, to some extent be grounded. And second thing, which I really felt interesting when we started about the method, about how understanding about friend things. So I would like to share with everybody, if anyone want, there is a program happening in Sweden. It's called METOD, METWD. It's called Method. And it's going to continue for 2 years, and probably next year Museum of Modern Art, like Modern Museum, is going to present the same thing. And I'm kind of one of the participants who are researching on that. And there is an Indonesian person who gave me a book called Queerly Mothering. So they said, as a curator, if you know how the really motherhood works, more intimate curiosity, but curiosity not spelled with C, but Q, Q-U-R-I-C-T-Y, queerly curious. And they said, like, then you are not dealing with an artifact or consignment. You are talking with a lively person, and it takes long time to deal with, like, everyday perspective. Yeah.
Thank you. There was someone at the back.
The commune has been hijacked by the right, my dear. The commune has been hijacked by the right. Where is the space for the left?
Take that as a comment. There's another question right next to you. Do you still have that question?
Yeah,
No.
why don't
Oh,
you-
yes.
Yeah, right here.
Okay.
It's not a question in that sense. I just want to say that after all what is being said, and it's very warm, heartwarming. And I feel that coming back to what you said, Anita, about co-producing future, I think the hub itself has so many people of so much potential. If this hub could actually lead us to that point, where the resources could be exchanged, we could have it more like, it's more open for everyone to have a dialogue further from these 3 days, because it happens each year. I am also a part of it, and I find such wonderful dialogues that come through. But I feel that if we could have some way that this continues or continue through the year, so that it, even Kolkata being a city, could benefit. There's so many people, creative people around here, not just artists, but everyone. So it's just a
Yeah, that's actually it's very important that you mention this, and I also just to sort of stress on that point. I mean, I kind of feel guilty because twice there's been an invitation to kind of go and say meet students at the art college here and also in Shantiniketan, etc. And we do come with very limited time, so. Absolutely, it's great. Let's think about ways, especially those of you who've been coming each year. Let's think about different ways in which, one second, I think this should then also be something that is an open document that people can contribute to. It's not necessary that you kind of throw ideas right now, but let's all think about ways to keep some kind of momentum. You don't need 10 curators here to kind of, constantly present and churn out, ideas and tell you what they're up to. There are other ways, but it should be a forum that has some kind of presence. And
Open to email addresses shared.
Sure. I mean, I don't think just sharing email address. I mean, there's enough hounding. Like there's social platforms and social media, and there's let's think about certain ways in which this is
and
facilitated.
what I'm hearing too, that this is about more of a homegrown thing that you're asking about too. It's not just about what can the visiting curators contribute, which I think we could all think about other ways that we can be activated in the city while we're here, but also what happens locally amongst this group too.
I would also say, this is happening regularly. So what can you create out of your own hub to occur at the same time? Or how can you suggest differing ways for visitors to engage? Don't leave it on the onus of experimental.
Yeah.
Wonderful idea that to have parallel things around the hub. That's wonderful. That's what I think festivals do. So it can be a kind of a movement, a parallel. Yeah.
That's also how you grow an ecology of discourse.
Hub and spoke.
Maria.
Can you pass on the mic this way?
This question is for Anita because I feel like all the conversations around the biennial consistently kind of hijack the amount of effort and courage and just the craft that went into the making of the Kochi Museum's Biennale. So we talk so little about the curatorial and the conceptual adventure that you went on, and we concentrate so much on everything else that is absolutely outside and beyond the purview of what you could have achieved as a curator or the power that was vested in you. I want to bring the conversation back to actually thinking about the Radical Painters and Sculptors Association. For whoever was writing art history at that point of time, it was seen as a rebellion that was also short-lived. But you kind of take that as an incision, as a productive space, and kind of bring that back into the exhibition that you produced in 2018. Because here a self-taught teacher, a self-taught artist sat with a teacher who had not shown work for like over 20 years. A along with an artist that had stopped practicing almost 30 years ago, was brought back. How did you think of time within the measure of this curatorial adventure to also bring back these, because a lot of the artists were also showing incredibly old work that was sitting perfectly in conversation with work that was produced in the context of the biennial or was site-specific. So how do these various time periods kind of feature as a typology for the exhibition that you made, and time is tempo?
Just thinking that, as I said, the need of the hour. This is required. For example, Shirin Nishat, yeah, it's a very old work. She herself was really mad with me, saying that I don't want to show this is old work, I want to show new work. But I said, Shirin, you don't understand, this is the work for us now. It makes perfect sense. It will make perfect sense. She's still unhappy. She stopped, actually she didn't come for the opening because she didn't like this whole thing. But I said, look, so this is weird, on the one hand, there is the voice of the artist, but artists are human beings. They want new, but you're operating in a particular context. Sometimes it's hard to explain to the artist that, okay, you understand it in this way, but this is the work that fits, and I have an audience that I'm speaking to. So this is an interesting thing, curators as autiers or whatever, I don't want to make it with a capital A, but there is this thing that you are in a specific place, you have a specific audience, you want to communicate to that audience because you know that particular work is going to speak. Now, as I said, this is a dialogue with artists. Sometimes it's not a thing that is, she's not happy. So these things happen.
And just to think aloud, the same non-alienated life, the exhibit that you put up, will change its context in 4 years' time.
Microphone.
I mean, the whole
Everything
grammar will be different.
Totally.
I mean, so government goes and all the definitions will kind of go on its head. So it's actually very flexible and.
We never got to see.
One second.
Question.
Hi, I'm Ananya. Along the same lines, actually, I got a chance to ask this question for a preview story that I had done to some of you, and Anita before the Biennale last year. So as individuals, all of us, especially the climate of things right now, we have opinions. We feel very strongly about certain issues. So what do you think about the relationship between art and activism? And as curators, how do you strike a balance between the two? Because, myself being a journalist and, Lord knows I have opinions about certain things, but I know that I have to strike a balance, I have to put out an unbiased report. So as curators, and, also being artists yourselves and all the other things that you all do, how do you strike a balance, between art, activism, and ensuring, art is for art's sake? What do you feel about it?
Can I just add on another question? It might take things in a different direction, but just because we're actually soon closing this discussion, I did wonder as well in this way of the sort of heavy expectations of when, on the one hand, the curator is meant to be an opinion maker, a leader, spokesperson, etc. And on the other hand, you're meant to strike a balance, you're supposed to be unbiased. You're definitely not meant to do things so that the work that you're showing, you already know what's happening in the back room when it's going to be sold off. That's not your problem, that's not your concern. So these are where we are at, right? It's sort of a crazy tightrope walk in a way. At the same time, I just wanted to ask as well, what do we do also when certain curators and artists gain sort of influence over the cultural milieu? I mean, people who we have deep respect for, whether that's OK Invezor or BC Silva, they have had their own struggles and their own journeys. And yet, perhaps there is a risk when they pass on that there is also a kind of hagiography. There's a lot of blurring of those very struggles, of the hostility that accompanied them on their journey, and the risk of creating a personality cult Just to really address that quite openly here, what is also our responsibility in those spheres?
That does take us in a very different direction. But I'll try to have a brief answer to both, which is, firstly, to your question, Natanya, I do not believe in art for art's sake. So there's my first baseline response to this question of activism. I personally don't consider myself an activist, only because I believe there are plenty of people who take this as a life role, and it's not something I do on the day-to-day, and so I can't put myself in that same category out of respect for the kind of labor that happens from activism. But I do happily call myself an advocate. So there are certain decisions that I make based on ethics, based on my very personal and particular goals about advancing the work of Black artists, artists of color in general, artists from the global South, however we want to define that, women. I mean, these are my advocacies. Questions around funding are things that I ask and have to answer to all the time. So that's the kind of advocacy work that happens for me, and that's my sort of baseline. And then when it comes down to artists as activists, I do believe it's my role to allow an artist a platform to do the work that they want to do. And if it's activism, I have to figure out how to make that work in whatever context it's working. So that's my relationship. And toward the question of the sort of hagiography and these kind of maybe struggles that happen in exhibitions, I think that's a very, very important question. And I'm not going to get into details about the problems and the struggles of the sort of curators I spoke about, but they were many and myriad, stretching from issues around this question of modernity and whether or not we buy into it or fight against it, all the way to Me Too. These are real conversations there. But I do think that very important point that we started off earlier in this panel discussion around dissensus is super important. That to bring forward the importance of someone's work is to also literally bring that work forward to a certain extent. Not to stop there, but to take it in another direction, whether it be through your opinions or someone else's or what have you. Nothing should be frozen, including artwork. So that's also my answer to Shireen. If you say that I'm only going to present something new, you're saying that every work up until this point is dead. And art history exists because I believe art history exists because art is always living and should be living. And again, my role as a curator is to think about the long term all the time.
Yeah, I think on that note of the relationship to activism is a question I've had to ask myself very carefully as a curator who hosts space that is of meaning to more than just that artist in question, but a community. So the question of sustainability of the voice becomes very important to ask. If you're an activist, what is your solution? If you're going to pinpoint a problem, what is your strategy for option 2? And if you don't have an option 2, are you really an activist or are you just reactionary? And I think that there is a lot of representation across the world right now where we have activism with no options. And it's presenting huge problems in governance. So I'm very careful around thinking that visual art should be seen as a vehicle through which we demand political change. I think they're triggers and contemplative spaces to which we should be allowing dissonance, and that those voices of dissonance deserve to have space in that grey cultural zone. And we need, as curators, I think, to better understand the collection of this material is to cultivate greyness. I think in the problem of eulogizing any personality comes through study. And if there's anything that I try to do through the curatorial coursework that I seem to weirdly keep getting asked to do, is to study certain characters and really focus on their failures as opposed to their successes. And it was really interesting. I just did this in New York, and they really grasped onto it in a way that was quite productive. So I think it comes to us as curators also to think about how do we eulogize our mentors, and to what extent do we create mappings of value around it.
Great. So on that note, we're going to actually watch a very short video from Paz's project on Afrosonic mapping by Satch Hoyt. Since she is not here today, just that I had mentioned to her that this is something we would watch also, and it sort of feels like a good way to round up this discussion hour. So if we can just watch that. And at the same time, I also just want to kind of just say concluding words as well, so that after this video, we can sort of continue onwards. But it really feels like every time we have this gathering, the circumstances, of course, 1 year later have shifted quite drastically. And sometimes in the negative, and sometimes there are small victories. But it does feel that this kind of is actually a space in which the temperature can be measured and taken. And one hopes that it feels more and more porous and more open, and that there can be these sort of parasitic ways to use this forum and then take departure points and do things also in a self-organized way. So thank you to those of you who are returning in different ways and contributing to this platform. I also just wanted to sort of, in this vein of, it's not to be negative, but I just felt to read this one quote, which is more also about the directions in which there is risk, there is vulnerability, self-censorship, etc. And I was thinking in that light towards this quote by Fred Moten and Stefano Harney, who write to kind of rethink the role of the state and really what is the state today, and what is our state given that we are part of the state. In a way, is that they say the state can't live with us and it can't live without us. Its violence is a reaction to that condition. The state is nothing other than a war against its own condition. The state is at war against its own resources, in violent reaction to its own condition of impossibility, which is life itself, which is the earth itself. And again, it's not to be, it's just something that, like Zoe's quotes, it's something we can just read in different variations. And now we can listen to this music by Satch Hoyt, and then thank you so much. Have a good evening.
Really, the audience and the curators. The Curators Hub won't be a hub if you don't be part of it, so thank you very much. I'm very, very grateful to everybody here that all of you have enabled conversations that inspire and make us think and reflect more. As I said in the beginning, when we started, we like to introspect, thinking about what we do or what all of us do, or where we stand with respect to everything else that's revolving around us is important for us to acknowledge and understand. So thank you for letting us do that yet another year. I would really like to thank Natasha in bringing this together in terms of weaving through the conversations, making us reflect on the key aspects of what we discussed every day, and it was really wonderful to do this. A big thank you for her. Yeah. And of course, all our partners who helped us realize this project, the Mutwani Jadeja Foundation, Australia Council for the Arts, the Australian Government, US Consulate General Kolkata, the Goethe Institute Kolkata, and the Take On Art magazine, and above all, the spirit of our team and the experimental team, which is really like family, and thank you so much. Thank you, everybody. And I hope to see you all next year. I mean, most of you, and if you guys want to come back, most welcome. But yeah, yes, thank you. So enjoy yourselves. See you next year again. Thank you.